Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today in the Economy Show, we're going to go through some different snippets. In the first segment, we're going to talk about the vaccine, COVID, and then what are the impacts to GDP based on the data we're seeing, not only from debt, but also from high frequency and daily activity numbers. Then we're going to go a bit more in depth into the U.S., looking at using some home-based data and looking at small businesses and the pressures there, and then some of the better side of where things sit in the U.S., specifically looking at housing, some of the different consumer numbers just based on where some of the shifts are. Then obviously we're going to talk about Europe, and a big focus is going to be the euro today, just because we're lasered in on the ECB meeting on December 10th, which I think is going to be important. And then wrapping up with Asia, talking about some leading indicators that continue to improve, and then what's happening with some recent bankruptcies within China. So just before we get in, again, please like, share, subscribe. We appreciate your support. And just a reminder, we do have our big report coming out next week that it's going to look at the U.S. fracking market, horsepower available that's being marketed, what percentages are companies actually utilized, and then a deep dive into the NGL U.S. market, the liquids international market, and then a bigger report on China and what to expect going forward. Getting right into so last week we had a huge data dump, and they were kind enough to do it on Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So some of the data we covered on Wednesday of last week, but we're just going to rehash and just as additional data's come out to either support or refute some of the things that have happened. But this is just a reiteration and I think a prettier graphic coming that Bloomberg put out, looking at the OECD. So as we talked about, they cut their 2021 global growth forecast to 4.2% from 5% in September. Again, as we've been saying, we expected a lot of these numbers to reduce lower, especially as we get a resurgence of cases. Again, a second wave or a third wave, depending on how many waves you think there's been. We always assumed things were going to get worse in the winter, and we saw the data, supporting that. So that was what kept us cautious overall as we were projecting into not only just into the end of the year, but what does 2021 hold? There's a lot of, as we joke, the market has climbed the wall of worry and has priced everything to perfection. I mean, the market is pricing in not only multiple expansion, revenue expansion, normalization, jobs coming back. There is a lot that is being priced in, and if there's any kind of hiccup, the issues could quickly, easily arise. So when we look at this specific chart, most major economies face a long haul to recovery. Again, not something that is surprising. And then the size of the economy in 4Q 2021 versus 4Q 2019. And you can see the pressures continue to mount in a lot of these different regions. The one bright spot that continues to be highlighted is not only just China, but also that Southeast Asia. When we think about the new trade deal that was signed by China, Australia, Japan, and the Southeast Asian nations, we have to think about, okay, well, what is China really talking about? Is it something where right now there's a difference between a supply recovery and a demand recovery? And so far we've seen a big focus on supply, get manufacturing back, get things, up and operational, but where is the demand? Because when we look at the 5-year Plenum Plan and we look at the dual circulation system of trying to develop a more robust local market, and it's because they know that there's going to be a lot of slowdowns abroad. When we look at 2018 into 2020, we were already bearish as we saw things starting to slow, a lot of these leading indicators. And unfortunately, we think China and the estimates for China still remain fairly robust. And they should be normalizing. We're seeing an increase in bankruptcies, both good and bad, because one, good, they're going bankrupt, they're restructuring, they're showing that they're being diligent, but at the same time, a lot of them are SOEs. We're finding out that there's a huge amount of borrows that go into it. There's some great Financial Times articles that cover that in grave detail, which I think is going to soften some of the expected increases in the Chinese GDP numbers. But just to kind of look a little bit deeper into just what contributed to the U.S. and just where do we see those problems coming forward, especially as stimulus remains stuck in Congress with not too much coming out. And when we think about the U.S. and Congress, we also have to consider, well, what is the U.S. doing with Chinese firms listing in the U.S.? What does the restrictions look like? How restrictive is it going to be? Because now they won't get the exemption to some of the accounting laws that we have within the U.S., and that could put additional problems in terms of making Chinese companies compliant with U.S. Accounting standards. So, but at the same time, they also have stimulus. And when we look at what do we expect coming from the U.S. government, they have to increase spending or they have to increase the budget because otherwise the government will shut down December 11th. And then the Congress goes on vacation December 21st. So when is this going to get passed? When are we going to have, because right now there's a lot of things that have to happen in order to get stimulus into the market. And this is why it's so important, because when you look at consumer spending and just the sheer size in which it really drives that GDP sector, this is why stimulus is so important. Getting some of those benefits back to people. Right now, the one sitting in Congress that is trying to get approved would only increase or extend unemployment for a month. The emergency unemployment, the question is that enough? Will that be something to keep people spending? It's not going to give a one-time fee or one-time payment, which again was a huge jump in the April, May, and really into June was a big pop. So those are things to consider. But why are we so concerned about stimulus? Why are other people so concerned about stimulus? Well, global debt. So when we look at global debt, we'll likely surpass 360 trillion. Again, that's probably likely, or if the governments had any say, it would be way more than that. And hopefully we don't get to that point. But again, we've seen what debt has done and just the inherent growth over the last 20 years. And it's not, when we look at the household has obviously had a steady growth, but it's those non-financial corporations and governments in general have continued to be the biggest drivers of the debt that have trying to take advantage of low rates, trying to roll and trying to expand as much as possible. And then you had, the movement of buybacks, issue debt, buy back stock. And that was something that we saw a lot of individuals want. And we did have, obviously we had the financial crisis, which required debt or borrowings to get to the other side. And we just continued to have that stimulus that was again in 2019, in 2008, 2009, again in 2011, again in 2014, again in 2016, again in 2018. So it's just been a continuous move that has been driving us forward. And here we are. And at some point you have to turn off the spigot because we need to normalize something, or at least try to slow things down, because the market is near or at all-time highs in most countries. So what are we really trying to accomplish at this point, given the amount of debt loads and the overhang this is going to provide to GDP? As we get yield steepeners, as we get, the U.S. yield curve is steepened the most since 2018. Like, there are problems out there that continue to get worse as inflation expectations start to rise, as people start to demand a higher rate for borrowing, which is just going to increase your interest expense. Now, with that being looked at, we have to consider, well, why is borrowing happening right now? Well, obviously it's COVID stimulus. And I thought this was an interesting chart trying to highlight, just how much humanity has suffered across pandemics. And this, I think, helps put into perspective COVID-19 and the, while we want to make sure that we're cautious and we do the right thing, because you don't want these death rates to start to look like the Spanish flu and the plague, but it's good to put into context. Just when people start to spiral and start to get nervous and start to question things, and as we've seen suicide rates and all these things start to increase, it's like, just take a deep breath. These are the facts. These are the statistics. Obviously, 0.02% is the aggregate, and it's vastly different on a percentage level depending on your age group as well as your underlying health conditions. So, but just take a deep breath. This is where we sit, where we will get to the other side of this. And it's just, there's going to be pain along the way. And at the same time, you might say, well, Mark, you're saying we're going to get to the other side of this, but you're talking negative about GDP. It's like, yes, but if COVID didn't exist, I'd still be concerned about where GDP is and where things were going, just because there was inherent slowdowns already coming into 2020, just after we had that then the rally into 2018, and then things started to slow into 2019. Now, an interesting thing is vaccines and vaccines. So who would support for getting a COVID-19 vaccine when one is available? You can see in Asia, India, China, South Korea lead the charge in terms of those that would be willing to get it. And the Eastern, Western world is a little different. And when we look at France, I find that kind of surprising. But you can see Europe and the US is a bit more skeptical and would like to see more research done. The one benefit, we were actually talking about it before we came on, the one thing that does give me some comfort is, I'd feel better taking it myself than my kids, having a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And the nice thing is the government is saying, look, we haven't done enough testing. The companies are saying there's not enough testing. We really can't give it to the kids yet. We really need to hold off. And I think that is a comforting side where we are, even though it's important to get a vaccine out there, we need to go through the right stages. We need to go through those steps to really try to do this the right way, because if you go through the way these vaccines will be delivered, it really is revolutionary, and it's something that could change the way vaccines happen for essentially until we get another scientific revolution. So these are things to consider, to watch, and to make sure that they're rolled out appropriately. But in the meantime, we continue to see pressure in daily activity. So this is just looking at the global aggregate. So coming from Bloomberg Economics, they do a great job of assembling, and then we try to throw in some of our own stuff. And here you can see advanced economies continue to roll over, and you can see that they're taking a next leg down. And now, unfortunately, with the U.S. getting worse, with Germany extending, with France continuing to remain a problem, we're going to see that continue to roll over a little bit as we see emerging markets starting to crest and starting to come down. And now emerging markets have remained strong, but when we look at who are the buyers and just who can issue debt and where does the stimulus start to come into question, developed markets and advanced economies slowing means trade's going to slow, means their buying is going to slow, which is going to put pressure on those emerging markets and including China, which has really been able to capture a big part of the export market. And the question is how much of that can remain, especially as we get additional pressures. Now, breaking it out a bit more, we talked about this in the EIA show, but just to rehash just how things are really rolling over into year end. And it's a mixture of things. It's a mixture of COVID cases increasing, stimulus coming to an end, not just in the U.S., and pressures abroad as we see Europe and the United States continue to slow down, with accelerations coming out of Italy, France, and Germany. And the problem is, we were hoping France had bottomed and then bounced back up, but now we're seeing France and Italy continue lower. And just given the general economics and how they rely on tourists and other types of movements, it's just we're not going to get that the same way, and that's going to continue to eat into it. Because when we did this show, I think it was 6 or 7 weeks ago, we looked at how much tourism really drives GDP, and the biggest ones were Spain and Italy. So that's no surprise to see some of those pressures coming in. Now, when we look at emerging markets, here you can see that we've had a nice increase to the upside, and the ones that we remain concerned on is really India. India is the one that had a nice little increase through October, and now they're starting to slow back, roll over a bit. Turkey obviously is getting worse. Russia's getting worse. But for the most part, they have maintained and held a lot of their gains. Now, here you can see things are starting to flatline, and they're starting to consolidate around that 75 to 80%. And without developed markets really picking up the pace, it's going to be hard to see emerging markets really able to break out and retake that 100 level, which again is going to become that overarching problem, which is why when we're doing our GDP estimates and we're looking at things on a macro level, we remain concerned just the general GDP landscape, just because the demand for goods is going to be that overarching issue. So as you get inventories rebuild, as you rejuice the system, spending just isn't going to be there in the same way, which is going to impact infrastructure, which is going to impact the overall spending at the company level. The U.S. high-frequency data points getting a little bit more granular is continuing to get worse on the lockdown index, which is going to just prohibit people going to stores. Now, it's an interesting anecdotal side when you look at retail sales, where online sales are up 27%, but in-person sales are down 52%. So net, we're down about 25%, as we go into the holiday season on a year-over-year level. But when we look at same-store sales and we look at Redbook on a month-over-month level, they remain fairly strong. So even though year-over-year there's a problem, still things are progressing in a nice direction on a month-over-month level. But as we go into and we see cases increasing, as we see lockdown indexes increasing, this is just going to change consumer behavior, and people are going to limit the amount they're going out. People are going to rush now, get as much done as possible, and then sit home and try to maybe quarantine or do something before seeing family for Christmas and Hanukkah and other holidays that end out the year. India is the one that we've been talking about. And we're now seeing new active cases increasing. We're seeing new COVID cases rising. We're seeing a lockdown index that has gotten worse. We're seeing some things turn over and not for the better, which is getting us consumer sentiment, the way congestion index, and all of that is linked to the activity in India. And we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail in the last segment, as we start to look at some of the problems that are persisting throughout different parts of the economy, and just not just India, but also how is India impacted across the rest of Southeast Asia, and how does that interact with the U.S. Specifically? Now, when we take this on a global level, when we look at PMI index on global, you can see that the PMI output index is back into growth. We're back at about 55. And that just means that manufacturing production, you can see the leading indicator. So we will get more manufacturing production. We will see an additional increase as that supply side of the economy continues to be fairly robust. And when we talk about PMI specifically in Europe, I think it shows it the most, and parts of Asia, there is a difference between manufacturing and services, where manufacturing PMI is either at estimates or above estimates, where service estimates or service numbers are either at or below estimates, and the estimated levels are still in contraction, and they're missing contraction. So we're getting this bifurcation within the economy, and services is a big part of obviously the developed market. So without services picking back up, that will see a longer term problem, even as manufacturing does continue to be the bright spot. And when we break down the Asian manufacturing PMIs, you can see the shifts. November had a little bit of a walk back for Vietnam. Japan continues to struggle, but we're starting to see some other expansions in some areas like Indonesia, South Korea, Australia, and specifically Taiwan. The one that's interesting is China, because we're again that bifurcation is real when we look at the overall underlying components, where imports continue to be soft, exports continue to be very robust, but they also import raw materials. They import semi-finished goods. So as those imports continue to weaken or remain well below those export levels, the question is, how does local demand look, and how for how long can they keep up those export numbers? And I think we're going to get a good backdrop of how the health of the internal market when we look at Lunar New Year, which is a fairly big traveling point, and without many people going abroad, we're going to see how does spending look, how are people moving around, and this could give a better semblance to the strength of the local consumer. Now, when we look at ISM backdrops, you have to understand it's like, okay, well, what's happening in the U.S.? How is the U.S. recovering? And when we look at it, the survey was for 58, the actual was 57.5. So you can say, okay, missed estimates slightly, but it's still expansionary. It's still in a positive territory, and it's really being driven by new orders, which is a big positive, and as well as, so there are new orders and there's also new export orders. Both of them are going to be positive for our economy in general. The bigger, the problem that I remain concerned with and we keep harping on is employment. Employment actually went into a contractionary level. So even though we're seeing more manufacturing, more activity, we're still seeing a decline in the amount of people getting hired, which is something that we're going to show in the next segment when we go a bit more in depth into hours worked. And that's when we start to look at, again, this is those PMI estimates as the backdrop of employment, where we're now back into a negative territory, which is going to be a problem when we look at, okay, well, what does stimulus do? If we lose stimulus, can people get jobs? What does employment look like? And again, there remains that consistent problem. Now, looking at China manufacturing versus the ISM manufacturing index, this is just showing that we will get more support for some manufacturing within China itself. The question is going to be, how sustainable is it? Where does this look? Because we've seen them adjust year ago numbers to help kind of bridge some of the gaps that they've seen in some of the numbers in 2020. Again, it's the supply versus demand side, and we've gone in depth in some of our reports, and we're going to do another one coming out that looks a bit more in depth on the debt side. What does that debt overhang look like against the GDP growth? Can they really grow into that debt? What does that look like as they start to roll? And these are things that we've covered over the last 3 or 4 weeks. We've covered in some of our reports, and we'll talk about as we go through some additional defaults that have recently come up and that the Financial Times and some others have covered really well, just to kind of put a spotlight on some issues that I think aren't being focused on enough, or at least talked about enough as the tip of the iceberg of problems, just beneath the surface on the debt side within China itself.